Hello everyone, Fran here at New Testament Explained. We are continuing our study of Anthology 5, which is where we look at 8 passages from the Gospel of Luke, and what we are trying to learn when reading these different passages is when did Luke think the kingdom of God was going to arrive, and what we secondly look at by default almost is what will that kingdom be like in terms of who will enter, who will not, and so on. Again, if you're not subscribed by now, make sure you are subscribed to both the channel and the notification bell. So in terms of what happens in this parable then, it all revolves around a man's invitation to a great banquet. Those invited make excuses not to attend, and 3 excuses are named by Jesus. One is a man who had recently bought a field. Second is someone who had recently purchased 5 oxen. And number 3, one of the people had recently got married and wanted to spend time with his bride. Now, the servant goes back to the master and says, look, these people have all declined the invitation, at which point the host of this banquet sends the servant out into the streets, to the lanes, to the poor people, to the blind, to the lame, and they are all invited to attend. When the servant goes back and says that we've still got room left, we're still not full, the invitation is extended again to travellers from outside the city who may not even know the host. And then there is a conclusion to this parable that notes that those who were originally invited will not share in this banquet anymore. Now, this parable also appears in Matthew 22, 1-14, but Luke's version is very different. And because it is so different, we're actually going to look at that in the following slides. Now, again, this passage is broken down onto different slides. And in the first section we're going to look at, we get the line, a certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests. Now, in that line, the certain man represents God. The great banquet symbolises the messianic banquet. And the many guests who are initially invited are the people who expected to enter the kingdom of God. So it will be people like the Jews and the Pharisees. The servant who was sent to invite these guests can be seen as Jesus. Now, what we get is a series of excuses made by people initially invited. So the first one who bought a field, it was culturally natural to get out of obligations in that context. But again, what the point is here is that attending the banquet should be seen as the most important. The second person who would buy 5 oxen, it's just all about priorities not being right. And then the final one who's just got married. It's interesting in the sense that Deuteronomy just have 2 passages whereby the recently married could be freed of obligations. So you've got Deuteronomy 22 and then Deuteronomy 24:5. But in this context, it doesn't make sense as to why marriage would be a reason not to go to a banquet. So you've got 3 reasons that make sense culturally to a early Christian reader. They could probably see why those excuses were used, but they are not good enough ultimately. And they are going to see these people sort of left out of the kingdom of God as a consequence. Another parallel you can draw is that these excuses may be compared against the inferior soils in the parable of the sower. We've got people here who should be attending the banquet but are like the inferior soils who have just got different priorities. So you might say they're like the seed that they're like the thorns where the seed falls, because they are more concerned with earthly matters than the kingdom of God in this case. So looking at the second part of this passage then, so we start with the servant came back. This is a point of difference to Matthew's version of the parable of the great banquet. Whereas in Luke's version, the servant comes back, in Matthew's version, the servant is killed. So on the off, Luke's version is less violent. So the servant comes back and tells the master, i.e. God, is angry about the people giving excuses for not attending and orders his servant, i.e. Jesus, go out into the streets and the alleys of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind and the lame. Firstly, this is another part of the parable that contrasts against Matthew's. In Matthew's it says, he sent out his army to destroy the murderers and burn their towns. And therefore, Matthew's version is much more apocalyptic. The army itself could represent the apocalypse, the end times. And therefore, Luke removing the apocalyptic turn could fit into the idea of salvation history and the idea that the parousia, the second coming of Christ, has been delayed and it's not happening yet. So you can deduce that from what we've read so far. Secondly, looking at the same quote about going out into the streets, it puts the emphasis of entering the kingdom of God on accepting the invitation. It's about believing in Jesus, which again links to John's prologue, topic 2.1, that you've got to believe in Jesus, not just have beliefs about him. And what it ultimately suggests is that entry to the kingdom of God is no longer based on kind of being Jewish and part of that official invitation list. It has now been extended to Gentiles and social outcasts, which again fits in with consummation and salvation history and the idea that stage 2 of salvation history, where Jesus comes to earth and makes the kingdom of God accessible to all, it aligns nicely with what is said here. Finally, the servant comes back and there is still room at the banquet. So the master told his servant, go out to the roads and country lanes and compel others to come in. And I tell you not one of those who were invited will get a taste of my banquet. So you've got an even further push on this notion of the kingdom of God being universal and the idea that entry is not restricted. It's about your belief and accepting the invitation, but it also challenges groups like the Pharisees, and it challenges their assumption that they have gained entry automatically, to maybe rethink that and to realise there is more to entering the kingdom of God than simply being a Pharisee. And ultimately, the kingdom of God will go on without them if they do not sort of respond to these challenges they're facing. That then is the end of my analysis of the parable of the Great Banquet. As always, make sure you're subscribed and make sure you tune in for the final videos that will help us complete our analysis of Anthology 5.